Good evening and welcome to the Bronx Buzz. This is Bronx Buzz program where we talk to reporters and writers and editors and journalists and people who are writing stuff about the Bronx and putting stuff out about the Bronx. And we're going to talk education in our first segment. Second segment, we usually talk to performers and authors or photographers or others who are also putting stuff out. And this evening, we're going to be entertained by a former Daily News editor who now is a travel reporter, and he traveled the Amazon. He's going to show us some of that. Anyway, let's go to the city and the Department of Education and talk to our buddy Alex Zimmerman, who's a reporter for Chalkbeat New York. So, Alex, good evening, and it is nice to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Alex, you wrote about a number of things that are of particular interest to me. Something that was passed through the news channels, but not really analyzed until, of course, you and our friends at Chalkbeat analyzed, is the Chancellor has a literacy agenda that he wants to redo how the public schools look at literacy. You did a nice analysis of the possibilities. What is the Chancellor trying to do, and how is he trying to implement?
Yeah, so big picture, New York City public schools have had an enormous amount of freedom to pick which reading curriculums they want to use, which has meant that schools all across the city use dozens of different kinds of materials, and there have been really uneven results. We know a large share of the city's students aren't reading on grade level. And so the Chancellor, David Banks, has come in and he's really made two big literacy pushes. One would be to require that schools all use, pick from a standardized set of phonics programs, which are lessons that really explicitly teach the relationship between sounds and letters. And what I think is actually the bigger change is they're also requiring that schools use a standardized set of literacy curriculums. So every superintendent in New York City is going to have to choose one of three curriculum options that every school in their district is going to use. And so we're now seeing that play out. About half of districts are going to have to implement one of those three programs this September. And then the following September, the second half of schools in New York City are going to have to implement.
Before we look at the curriculums, I just want to ask you about the analysis of the numbers. It would not surprise me if any children or any schools are having difficulties. Are they finding trends in certain neighborhoods, or do we think that, because I'm thinking of ethnicity and economic status and all that, or are they finding it doesn't follow that pattern, but it really is with the school and the principal and the way that education is being delivered? Or am I asking an unanswerable question?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's just true about New York City public schools, it's a system that's enormously vast. It's a system that's predominantly students of color, predominantly Black and Hispanic, predominantly low income. There are lots of factors that interrelate in terms of students' reading ability. I think the goal of sort of getting schools more on the same page is less to say there are schools in certain pockets of the city where we really need to make a change, though I think that that may be the case. I think it's more like the city wants to make sure that every school is using something that they think is high quality, and it also enables a kind of teacher training that's difficult to pull off when every school is doing something different.
And let me just add in, given the size of the school system, if you can actually get some unanimity, some consistency with something that you know is true, maybe you have a chance to improve everybody's score. I mean, in a way, my question was barely fair anyway. But there
are two other pieces to that too, which is, especially high need students who are in temporary housing, which represent about 10% of the school system.
Yep.
Like students who are highly mobile, a part of the idea of standardizing things a little bit means that if they switch schools, they're less likely to be, suddenly under a new curriculum and starting from
very good point. Yes.
And the corollary to that is teachers also change schools. And so then you might not have a teacher, if you're a teacher and you're switching schools, you might not have to be trained on it.
Yeah, right. Then you walk into the building, you're like, well, this is how we do it here. But the other thing, which I think is smart, and I have to say, people in the Bronx know David Banks, of course, he was a principal and a founder of I can't even think of the name of the academy, but
Eagle Academy.
Eagle Academy, of course. I knew it began with an E, and I couldn't find it. But yes, he was the founder of Eagle Academy, which has been a very successful educational enterprise, and I don't think there's any question about it. But what he did here, which was smart, rather than say, this is the curriculum we're going to use, he gave schools three choices, right? And you reported that wit and wisdom and L education are becoming most popular. I have no idea what that means. Enlighten us.
It's actually the reverse. EL education and wit and wisdom are the least popular of the
The
three.
least popular. I'm sorry. Then
That's
I
okay.
pulled out the wrong ones.
The most popular is a program called Into Reading, which is published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I just pulled the wrong ones off my page. Go ahead.
No worries at all. And yeah, I mean, I think that there's, I'm doing some work right now to try to unpack what the key differences are between these programs. But Houghton Mifflin did something that in retrospect is probably pretty smart, which is they made a lot of their materials free for schools to use during the pandemic. And so
so the other ones are charging for the.
No, well, it's interesting.
Let's not say that out loud.
Yeah, actually, Houghton Mifflin is a for-profit company, and I think like part of their strategy was they had all these materials that were digital already, and so when schools pivoted to remote learning, there was a big opportunity for them to share materials for schools to use. And that got schools sort of familiar with the materials, and I think has helped them get a little bit of a foothold. But I think there's also like substantive reasons that some superintendents are going with Into Reading, which is that it's what's kind of known as an anthology model, which is sort of like a textbook that has like all of the readings that students are going to need in it. And it's sort of jam-packed with lots of different strategies, and there's sort of like something for everyone in it. And I think that is appealing to lots of schools and principals, but I think there's also critique of it, which is that like its texts aren't always as rigorous as the other two, and that's a little bit more scripted.
Yeah, listen, we'll let the schools make a decision. You and me can have a great conversation, but it won't mean a heck of a lot because the principals will make decisions, or it comes out of the district and said, this is what our district will use.
It comes out of the district. So principals don't actually get to decide which curriculum their school.
Well, you hope that the superintendents have some relationship with the principals, and this works for what, K to 5, K to 8,
K to 5,
K to 5. Okay, listen, let's put a note on our calendars to have you back in a year, and then we'll find out if anything was successful, or we're still treading water, or where we're at. That fantastic. It's very interesting, and it's just so important. And with everything going on in the news, it flies under the radar, and that's why we're thrilled to have you with us. Next thing I want to talk about is the school budgets. Now, you wrote a piece called "New York City Won't Slash School Budgets at First," but the chancellor said we may have to do something along the way. Let's just talk about the state legislators, and I interviewed them, were very pleased with the amount of money the state allocated to New York City public schools. Let's start there.
Yeah, so I mean, big picture, New York City public school enrollment has been falling, and it was falling before the pandemic, but those enrollment declines accelerated during the pandemic. And that poses a real challenge for schools because funding is allocated on a per student basis in terms of school budgets. So if you have fewer students, you get fewer dollars. And so what the city has been doing during the pandemic is using federal relief dollars to keep school budgets steady. So in other words, if you lost students, you didn't necessarily lose funding.
I see, but if you gain students, then you'd apply to the Fed.
Well, no, if you gain students, then you would get more money under
the more money. It's part of a formula. Oh.
Yeah. And so now what's happening is the federal money is running out, and the city has to make some difficult choices about, well, what do we do about all of these schools that have budgets that are higher than they would have been otherwise, but now have fewer students? And you can imagine real equity questions here, right? Like if you're funding a school that has 20% fewer students, like that is money that could be going to another school that's serving more.
Right. Which is a shame, because I'm sure the principal is sitting there and saying, goodness, I'd like to keep that funding because I can then do better.
Right. And it comes after this period of historic disruption, right? Where schools need to be doing everything they can to get students caught up. which is part of the logic of using that money to keep school budget steady. So anyway, so now the city is saying, there was the Adams administration had been saying, like, we're going to taper off this funding and we're going to begin to cut school budgets. And they did begin to do that.
The council was not thrilled, but I know
Right.
that is what the mayor said.
And so there's now been enormous backlash. And so what happened this year is the mayor said and the chancellor said, look, we're not going to cut school budgets
to start
initially.
Yeah.
But the thing that's tricky about that is, there's the amount of money that the city gives to schools at the beginning of the school year. But then in October, they do a count of how many students actually enrolled. And so if you enrolled fewer students than the city thought you were going to enroll, they claw some money back. If you enroll more students they thought you were going to enroll, they're going to give you some extra dollars.
Well, we'll again, another thing, we'll watch how it plays out. But it's a difficult and challenging proposition to to figure out how much funding. And as I said, I have great sympathy for the administrators in the school who say, well, we have fewer students. I'd like the same money, even though, of course, that's not reality. Last thing, just before, we got about a minute and a half or so, I just wanted to mention special ed, which is always so misunderstood. And the kids, they have individual problems, and the school system can't really provide individual attention. But you found a school in Brooklyn, but I wanted to let people know, PS 958, that seems to be able to deal with individuals with autism and other things. Just briefly tell us, why did you highlight the school and think they did the right thing?
Yeah, I thought it was like an interesting model because in New York City, students with the most complicated disabilities often end up sent to separate schools in a separate sort of district that's called District 75. And what's interesting about this school in Brooklyn is they are enrolling students who would have normally been sent to like a separate school that only serves students with disabilities. And they're trying to find sort of like innovative ways of including them in academic programming alongside students who are typically developing. And so one example of that is they sort of did this end of year project around like a mock school restaurant. And so they had students sort of go out in the community and sort of see what kinds of restaurants are most common. They've settled on a Mexican theme. They brought...
Listen, Alex, we're almost out of time. Let me tell you, I love this so much because there are ways to reach children, and getting them out of those classrooms and into kind of non-traditional ways of learning about food and learning about numbers or whatever it is. That's the way to do it. So congratulations to PS 958 in Sunset Park. Let's hope we can bring some of that brilliance to the Bronx. And Alex, we need you. Thank you so much for covering our schools. And it's a guarantee we're going to invite you back as more developed, especially when we get back to next year to find out how the funding formula worked and how the literacy programs work.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me and for spotlighting education issues.
Oh, we got
really important.
Thank you. We're going to take a short break, and then we will do some very interesting and a whole different type of thing, photography. Don't go away.